Good evening, everybody. I hope everyone is having a wonderful evening on this Thursday night. It's been a few weeks since I've been able to do a streamcast, and I apologize for that. Sometimes even doing things at midnight is really hard and hectic. So I hope many of you know already that the GLBA new guidelines that we've been covering over the last few weeks or the last few episodes, they get pushed off until next year. So one of the topics that I've wanted to cover for a little while that kind of came up over the last week or so is specifically doing a gap analysis and what that means and what you need to do and kind of how you need to think about it. This is a common thing that we have in IT and IT security. But specifically this week, I had two instances where during a scoping call or a meeting or an interaction, there was really a lot of confusion what a gap analysis is. So I thought we might cover that tonight. And doing a gap analysis is really important for what we do in IT security. And generally, it's around compliances. Generally, it's around requirements for a particular, maybe it's a contract, maybe it's regulation, it's industry regulation, maybe it's a new project. If you're doing a new project and you want to do a gap analysis around that project and the things that you need to do, sometimes those pieces are all part of it. So, let's talk about. Let's talk about the difference between a gap analysis and a risk assessment. These get, I believe, it feels like these get confused a lot, especially when I'm having conversations with people and they're talking to maybe a third-party vendor, someone who's coming in to assist them, and they're asking for a gap analysis, and they keep calling it a risk assessment. When we talk about a risk assessment, that was actually one of the things that we've done an episode on is how do you conduct a risk assessment. And that risk assessment is you take a process or a service or a tool and you sit down and you write down the different things that could go wrong, that it could get maybe it could get hacked, maybe you lose the password, maybe the drive fails. Anything that you have to sit down and reasonably think about a list of all the things that could happen on that particular item, that thing, that could affect it. They're going to have a negative effect on that service, that tool, that data, whatever it may be. And then you take that risk assessment, you take the list of risks, you think about the threats. Let's say password brute force attack, who could do that, how could they do it, and then you think about the risk mitigations. So you put together this list of things that could go wrong and how those things could go wrong, and then you decide how you're going to mitigate that risk. So that is a risk assessment. What a gap analysis is thinking about where you are at right now on a particular thing, let's say a compliance or a project, deciding where you want to be, and that gap in the middle is what that gap analysis is for. Now we're going to go into a bit more detail on this. We're actually going to use a compliance as an example. But that's ultimately what it is. It's where are you at right now and where do you want to go, and then you find the pieces in the middle that you need to fulfill to be able to do that. Now, there's a lot of things you do with a gap analysis. So when you go get a gap analysis, actually let's talk about where you get a gap analysis done at. You can absolutely do a gap analysis. And in fact, you should always do the first gap analysis. When you are looking at doing anything new, again, let's pick a compliance. Let's say, I don't want to use PCI right now because we're going to get that in a minute, but let's say there's a new PCI compliance or a new compliance, maybe a new privacy compliance. I do a lot with privacy compliances, and that's one of the things that you do is a new law comes into effect in one of the states that you have customers in or you have students in, first thing you do is you read through that law and you figure out what are the new requirements. And then you look internally in your organization to see where are you at now and how can you meet this. That is a gap analysis. So you should absolutely do a gap analysis for yourself, for your own organization. Now, there are times where you need to get help. You need help out in the world, and this could be a vendor, this could be a subject matter expert, this could be a consultant. Sometimes you need help to have them come in, and sometimes it's even required. But you have this person come in, and they help you perform this gap analysis. Now, when I say help you, they're going to ask you a bunch of questions, and they're going to they're going to ask you, where do you want to be at? What does the end result need to look like? And that may be a requirement for a contract or a new security requirement or anything like that. They're going to ask you where you want, and then they're going to start asking you questions of where you were at right now. And then they're going to take all that stuff and they're going to put together in a report, and they're going to tell you what you need to do to be able to meet the requirements that you have. And everyone does it a little different. I've done it exactly like that, where I ask them, where are you needing to be? And then I ask a whole bunch of questions to figure out where they're at right now. And then I write the report in the middle. I say, okay, for you to meet this requirement, you need to do these things. Then in some cases, I will go in and help them implement those things. But I mean, that's generally the pieces of it. So going back to the privacy thing, when a new law comes out, exactly what we're doing with the GLBA in the previous episodes, we see what their guidelines are. That's where we need to be at. And then all of the things that we are doing in terms of meeting those requirements is part of the gap analysis. We look at where we're at, we look at where we need to go, and then we figure out how to get in the middle. So that is the fundamental pieces of a gap analysis. And honestly, we do this all the time. We look at where we want to go, and we figure out how to get there. What is our budget? What's our resources? We build a project around it. We may need skill sets. We may go out and have to get some skill sets, and whether that's going and getting training, maybe we hire individuals in, maybe we hire a contractor in that has a particular skill set. That's all part of the gap analysis. What do we need right now to be able to get to where we need to go? Okay, so I think I've covered what a gap analysis is and why that's different from a risk assessment. So I think we've got some good terminology down. Now, I will say this. I may have actually said risk assessment by accident because I've got them both on the brain. We're doing a lot of this stuff. We're doing a lot of risk assessments right now, and we are doing some gap analysis in that right now. So if I misspeak, I apologize for that. We do this live. I do this live. It's midnight. It's midnight 3 right now. It's late. It's a long day. It's been a long couple of weeks, and so just bear with me. Okay, so what we have tonight, I thought what we would do is actually take one of my favorite compliances. I know this sounds kind of funny, but it actually really is, and that's the PCI DSS. Generally, we're talking about payment card industry, PCI, credit cards. These are the requirements that you need to do to be able to take credit cards. The PCI Council is the 5 major card brands come together. They put together all their security requirements. They call it the DSS, the PCI DSS. And that is what you follow. Now, what I like about the PCI DSS is it's very straightforward. If you kind of step away from the idea that this concerns cardholder data or credit card data and just think about it of confidential data, and you can do these 12 things, that's great. And they talk about setting up a secure network and don't use default passwords and look at your logs and have good policies. I mean, these are the basics that any security program needs to have. And when we're talking about maybe an organization who doesn't have any security framework, doesn't have any security program, honestly, I like using the PCI DSS as a starting point. Now, you could very quickly move from that to the CIS 18 or NIST or ISO 27001. You know, you basically go up in terms of difficulty at that point, in terms of the number of controls, the number of things you're doing. But I can tell you, if you're not doing the 12 requirements of the DSS in your environment, there is no way you're going to be able to do the 171 controls in another framework. It's just, you've got to do the basics. You've got to do the fundamentals. So I thought I might use the PCI DSS as an example tonight, or for the next few minutes, and talk about doing a very quick gap analysis of maybe the first couple of requirements of the PCI DSS. So let me switch over to the screen. Now, when we are talking about the PCI DSS, again, there are 12 requirements, and then each of the requirements is broken down into the pieces inside the DSS. You know, this particular one is processes, mechanisms for installing and maintaining a network security controls are defined and understood. Now, what does this mean? Well, generally speaking, what this means is we understand all of our policies as it relates to network security controls. Policies and procedures and how we're doing it. It kind of encompasses everything. But let's talk about specifically what it says here. I think I can make this a little bit bigger to make it come up on the screen a little bit better. I don't think that's doing it. But we zoom in a little bit. Try to make it just a little bit. There we go. How about that? All right. Well, first thing we do. Oh, the zoom messed me up. Sorry about that. Welcome to doing live streams on computers. All right. So, processes and mechanisms for installing and maintaining network security controls are defined and understood. Let's just look at the basic defined requirements. All security policies, operational procedures that are identified in Requirement 1 are documented, kept up to date, in use, known to all affected parties. Okay, so that's fair. I mean, I think that's a fair requirement as it relates to network security controls that are defined. Expectations, controls, and oversight for meeting activities within Requirement 1 are defined, understood, and adhered to by affected personnel. All supporting activities are repeatable, consistently applied, and conform to management's intent. Now, we are not going to go into what these controls are. I might use one as an example, but that it doesn't matter the controls. All we're talking about is this requirement. We are going to do a quick little gap analysis of this requirement. So let's assume that our organization is trying to decide if they are going to meet the PCI DSS, that they are meeting these requirements. And this is the first one they're looking at. Now, we don't know anything about the environment. So let's say I'm coming in as a consultant and the organization has told me they want to meet the PCI DSS. My job is to look at this first requirement, and I'm going to start asking them some questions. What are your security policies? Now, in my head, there are some security policies that I want to see. So maybe it's network security policies, such as, again, I don't want to go into a lot of detail because it's not important right now, but let's say What devices can get onto the network? What is your firewall policies? How is your firewall maintained and managed? Who updates your firewall? What are the change management around your firewall? There's all these things. But again, we don't care about the specific controls or the policies within. What we care about is this requirement. So, we're going to take this first one. Are all security policies, operational procedures that are identified in requirement 1, are they documented? What does that mean? That means, are they written down somewhere? Now, there could be an electronic document. You could have them printed. Do you have them written down? A lot of organizations, they go, oh, yeah, we have a change management policy for our firewall. Great. Is it written down? Do you have in a Word document or a PDF somewhere, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, who is the change manager, who does this, who is that? Is it documented? Now, as part of the gap analysis, where we want to be is that it's documented. My question to the organization is, do you have these policies documented? If you do, let me see them. So the organization goes through and they pull all their documentation, their policies out, and I look through them and I go, okay, this appears to be a good set of policies. It covers most of the pieces here. You have 2 or 3 things missing. That is your gap analysis. You have most of them. There's 2 or 3 things you need to create. If you create those things, you're going to meet this requirement. Now, number 1, is it documented? That's what I'm looking for. Is it kept up to date? I'm going to look at these documents and say, okay, the last time this was updated was 10 years ago. That's probably an old policy. It's pointing to old websites. It doesn't have the right individuals on there because people have changed positions. So, is it kept up to date? My gap analysis would be, no, it is not. You need to update your policies to meet the requirement of the PCI DSS. In this particular case, in this scenario. Number 3, is it in use? That one is actually really easy, though people make it really difficult. So if you have a policy saying that you make changes to your firewall after change management approval board, I'm going to ask you to show me the last minutes of your change management board meeting. Show me where the change management went into the system, it got approved, and that it was completed by someone, and that change management had been updated. So that change management process, as defined in your document, I want to make sure you're doing it. If you're not doing it, then that becomes part of your gap analysis. That's going to say, hey, you need to follow your policies. I'm going to write that in to be able to meet the requirements of the DSS. And the last one is known to all affected parties. So when we talked about policies, or when I talk about policies, I talk about policies kind of you got to have a couple of things. Number 1, you got to have it written. Number 2, you got to have it communicated. Number 3, you've got to have it enforced. If you don't have all of those 3 things, then you don't really have a policy. You have a piece of paper somewhere. So, known to all affected parties, you have to make sure that everybody who can make changes to, in this case, in this little scenario we're doing, if this person can make changes to the firewall, that they know what the policy is and that they follow the policy, i.e. the number 3 there. So, these here, I'm going to highlight all these. We've just spent 10 minutes talking about this one little section of this one part of 1.1 on the PCI DSS. Now, let's talk about, in this particular case, when we're looking at the PCI DSS, they actually present the testing procedures. So you can download this from the PCISecurityStandards.org website, and you can take a look at this. I just like using it because it's a good example. But 1.1.1, Defined Approach Testing Procedures. Examine the documentation and interview personnel to verify that security policies and operational procedures identified in Requirement 1 are managed in accordance with all elements specified in this requirement. Okay, so I'm going to examine the documentation, then I'm going to go talk to people. And then I'm probably going to ask them to demonstrate or to show me documentation or show me proof that a change management has gone in or this or that or whatever. So again, it's not important about the specific control element that we're talking about. All we care about is what is the gap analysis trying to do. The gap analysis sees that you've got to do these things. So the person who's doing your gap analysis is going to ask you, are you doing them? Now, I talked earlier about making sure that the person that is doing your gap analysis has some experience. Is a SME, is it experience, is a consultant or whatever. And you can absolutely do this in your own organization if you have experience in it. And you should, even if you don't have experience, you should go through and do this. You should ask these questions in every one of your processes, because you go through, you will find stuff that you're not doing right now and that you could do better. So go ahead and do that gap analysis internally and then see where you need help at. Then you can go out and get someone, get a third party, get someone in to help you that has some training, has some experience, and they can go, okay, they'll ask you the exact same questions you may have asked. They might look at it from a different point of view, or they might have more questions. They might have a more detail. But the important part is they're going to ask you things in the testing procedures. They're going to ask you when they're interviewing you. They're going to have objective questions. They're going to have experiences that you probably don't have that can otherwise help you get better in your environment. I'm big into training. I'm big into training and getting people's skill sets in terms of what they're doing. So if you are specifically going after PCI, there's some great training out there about learning more about PCI and what they're trying to accomplish. But a lot of this stuff is just general IT security fundamentals, doing change management, doing firewall rules, doing network segmentation, doing access control, doing multi-factor, doing policies and procedures. All that stuff is general IT experience, IT management, IT security management. And so that's what your gap analysis is doing. So let's go ahead and go to the second one. This is 1.1.2. So we've got roles and responsibilities for performing activities in requirement 1 are documented, assigned, and understood. This is pretty straightforward. Are people doing what they're supposed to be doing? So the 1.1 is, do you have it documented? Now, do you have everyone who's involved in this process actually understanding what they're doing, and are they assigned to it? A perfect example, if we're talking about a change management policy of any kind, you probably have a change management board and a change manager. And then you have the people who are putting in the changes. Now, does every one of those people, based off your change management policy, understand what their roles are? So the change manager might be the one who a change will go in from the requester. They will work with that change or that requester and make sure that the change is fully documented. They have all the pieces they need. And then that change manager will take that and go to the change board and present this in a very standard format so that the change board can make a determination on whether to approve or not. But all those roles should be defined in your change management policy. If I'm coming in and I'm coming into your department and I'm going to ask you these things, that is what I'm expecting. Number one, you have the policy documented. You have the procedures documented. It's written down. It's being communicated. And it's being enforced. And then I'm going to look at that document and look at all the roles that this policy is otherwise talking about. And then I'm going to go ask them, okay, you are designated as a change manager. What do you do in your job? How do you do this thing that you're supposed to be doing? I might go to a change management board member and say, okay, How do you make these decisions? How do you vote on this? Where does that get documented? How does that go into the change management call tracking system? I might look and see who are the requesters of your changes. And I might ask them, okay, what is your process for requesting a change? How do you submit the change? How do you update the change? How does it be communicated back to you? How do you complete the change, then go back and fill in the final pieces of your change, the results of the change, how, if it was successful, what were the challenges? All the while, what I am doing as the gap analysis person is I'm looking at your roles and requirements. I'm asking these people questions, but then I'm documenting anything that I find. So I might be documenting that your roles are clearly defined. They are clearly trained and assigned to individuals. Those individuals understand their roles, and everything is fine. So at that point, you probably wouldn't have to do anything to meet the requirement. But let's say you have roles defined, but when I go and ask the requesters, how do you submit a request, a change management request? And if their response is, I don't know, I don't know anything about that process. Okay, so my gap analysis is you have the documentation, you have the policies, you have the procedures, but you're not clearly communicating them to the parties involved. That's the requester, the change management board. Now, again, we're going into a little bit deeper than I was going to in this particular topic in terms of change management, but it's a good use case scenario to think about how you have, this is what you should be doing, and this is what you want to be, this is what you are doing, this is where you want to be doing, and then the stuff in the middle you have to get to. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. I want people to be able to do a gap analysis pretty easily. These are not difficult things. So let's do one more, and I'm going to scroll down a little bit, just to find one for fun. Maybe I'll go to a 2. So when you're looking at something like a PCI DSS, you know, there's a lot of pieces to it, and as there should be. I mean, cybersecurity, IT security is there's a lot of pieces to it, and you know, you want to be successful at it, so there's a lot of things you have to think about. All right, let's what do we got here? The requirement 3: protect stored account data. Okay, I just kind of randomly scrolled through until I found something, so let's take a look at this. Protecting stored account data. So this is requirement 3, and they've got 3.1 through 3.7. 3.1 is processes and mechanisms for protecting stored account data are defined and understood. Storage of account data is kept to a minimum. Sensitive authentication data is not stored after authorization, and so on and so on. Now, again, these are specific to credit cards, but if you take a step away from it and just talk about you're protecting confidential data, these are all still things that you should think about in your environment. Do you have, so again, let's not think about credit cards right this second. Let's just think about process and mechanisms for protecting confidential data are defined and understood. The storage of confidential data is kept to a minimum. So, like I said, you know, while this is specifically, I can't get this to highlight, this is specifically talking about credit card data. If you take the concept of credit card data and pull it out a little bit and abstract this just a little bit, and you just think about confidential data, this is good controls. These are good things. So let's go look at 3.1. Interestingly enough, it has all security policies and operational procedures that are identified in requirement 3, i.e. the protecting of stored data, is documented, kept up to date, in use, known to all affected parties. So, again, what do you think the testing procedures are? Number 1, examine the documentation, and number 2, interview personnel to see if things are documented, things are kept up to date, and in use, known to all affected parties. So let's use this for an example. Protecting confidential data. I would say that, if I was going to start off at building a privacy policy or a confidential policy, storage of confidential data policy, the first thing I would do is, do we know all the places that confidential data is stored? More specifically, where do we want confidential data stored in our environment? So you might have a policy saying that you're only going to allow confidential data to be stored in this one area. Let's say it's OneDrive, or let's say it's a file share somewhere, or ERP network, or a server somewhere. So if you have in your documentation that this is where your stuff is going to be stored at, and you have updated it recently, let's say you have new servers. Therefore, since you got new servers, you have new server names. You want to make sure that's updated in the policy, and you sign off saying, this is the updated 3 months ago. It is in use. So if I go over to ask somebody, it's like, hey, where do you store X data? And they go, oh, it's going to be on this server, and it's only allowed on this server. Great. We know that people are using it. And number 4, known to all affected parties. So this would be everybody who's otherwise going to be storing confidential data. They know where it's going to go. And beyond that, if you have system administrators who are storing data or supporting the servers where that data is stored, they know that that data is there. They know that it's being stored there. So affected parties. Now, what's my defined approach testing procedures? I'm going to look at documentation, and I'm going to go ask people some stuff, and I'm going to have them demonstrate to me. I'm going to have them show me what it is, and then my job, if I'm the auditor, if I'm doing the gap analysis, is this is where we want to go. This is where we're at right now. What's in the middle? So if I find that the server administrators don't know that confidential data is being stored on their server, then that tells me that the security policies you have written are not being communicated to them in an appropriate fashion. So my gap analysis is probably going to be very simple of communicate to your system administrators the confidential data policy and make sure they are aware that this data is being stored on this server and that they have to take appropriate precautions around that data. So does that make sense? I think it does. And when we break it down to simple things, I think it makes it that much easier. So it's about midnight 30 now. I think I'm going to bring up a notepad, and we're going to do this. I would do it in Paint, and I know everyone loves my Paint pictures and stuff, but I think tonight we're just going to do kind of a very basic process. Now, when we talk about doing a gap analysis, we talk about first we need to know where we need to go, and we need to know how to get there. We need to know where we're at. And the difference is, the difference is how we get there. So, let's type some steps up. I think that this might be helpful for people. So, number 1, what are the requirements you are trying to meet? So what does this mean? Well, this could be that you have contractual requirements. This could be that you have regulations, industry requirements, BCD, specific threats. This is not all inclusive. I'm just kind of throwing some pieces out there. So the first thing you need to understand is, what are your current requirements? Now, when I talk about contractual requirements, that could mean that you have a third-party vendor that is, or you are a processor, or you are a third-party vendor or processor to a controller. and they are asking you to meet ISO 27001 certifications, or a SOC 2 report. You have to complete a SOC 2 report and have all that ready, or PCI, or whatever. So that is a contractual requirement. That means that you, to meet the requirements of this contract, you have to do this thing. That's pretty straightforward. Regulations might be a new privacy regulation. It might be new CISA requirements or Gramm-Leach-Bliley requirements. This could be regulations, it could be acts, it could be laws, you name it. Industry requirements. This is a little bit different. It could, well, like PCI is actually an industry requirement. It's not a law. It's if you're going to take credit cards, you have to meet the requirements of the credit card industry. So PCI is, I've always called it industry regulations or industry requirements, because it's not really a federal law. Specific threats. So let's say you were getting DOSed every other day, or DDoSed every other day. So you have a specific threat that's hitting your environment. You need to stop that threat. So you say, okay, what we need to do is be able to stop the DDoS attack. You look at what your environment is right now. It is not stopping the DDoS. So what do you have to do in the middle? So every one of these, again, excuse me, every one of these is specifically a, where do we want to go? Where are we at? Do a gap analysis in the middle till you get there. All right. So let's, number 2. Where are you at currently? Evaluate your policies. Evaluate your procedures. Make this even. Evaluate your current controls. And we'll leave that for a second. So, first thing you do, you have to figure out where you're at, or where you want to go. Then you figure out where you're currently at. Now, a lot of people do it the other way. They look at, where are you currently at? I'm sorry. It's getting late. It's midnight 30 still. I can tell you that I try to darken all of my screens here. Number one, so I don't affect the lights too much on the camera. And I don't know if that helps or if it hurts or if it makes me more tired, or at least, heavy eyes. But anyway, back to the gap analysis. So I've had a lot of people where they try to do this the other way, where they say, okay, where are we at currently? And then they try to decide where they want to go. And that works to an extent. I don't like that. I like starting with, where do you want to go? Because then you start looking at specific items that you need to change to get to where you want to go. It's just a little bit easier to work on the framework, work within that framework. So I am a big supporter of, let's start looking at your framework, see where you need to go, and then where you're at, how to get there. Okay, so where are you at currently? So you have to evaluate the policies and procedures. If you don't have them written down, that's the starting point, period. If you don't have them organized where people can actually read them, people just aren't going to do that. So you need to write them down. You need to have them organized, and they need to be communicated to individuals. Evaluate your current controls. So a lot of times the framework is, do you have MFA? Do you have encryption? Do you have access control list? Do you have a firewall? So as you're otherwise doing this stuff, you write that down. Yes, we have all this, and the policies around it. So go ahead and just build your list together of all your control library and have all your documentation there. Then you compare the two to where you want to go and where you are at. The This is 3. Okay, so the actual gap analysis is you compare the two. Where you want to go and where you're at currently. And pretty straightforward. Now, what this is actually going to do is going to create you a punch list or a checklist or a so when you have the things where you're at, where you want to go, you create this checklist, this punch list of, okay, we just need to do these things. Now, it's not that simple. I mean, I've had a lot of people where they say, oh, we'll just turn on multi-factor. Well, that's great, but there are things you have to do to be able to deploy these controls in your environment, and it's not just as simple as, oh, we're going to do this. I had somebody once, this was during a cyber audit, and the auditors came in and they said, okay, well, we were not able to evaluate these controls because they weren't doing them. And so the CTO at the time says, well, I'll just do the controls real quick. And the auditors were like, well, that's not the way this works. It's not. You're just flipping switches. Do you have it documented? Are you training people? Are you evaluating the effectiveness of this control? Is this control actually reducing your risk? There are so many pieces involved in it. It's not just flipping a switch. It's not just turning something on or off, because you may turn it on and it doesn't do anything because you're not evaluating that control. You're not doing a gap analysis on the individual control, which I think that's another piece that people don't quite understand is you could do a gap analysis of a very large project, or you can do a gap analysis on a single control. It's a mental process of where are we at now? Where do we need to go? How do we get there in the middle? So when you compare the two, you create this checklist. Then each one of those checklist items becomes we're going to call it a project, but develop. There we go. It's spelled correctly now. Downsides of using Notepad is it has no spell check for you. Develop a project process for implementing new controls, policies, procedures. Okay, there you go. So you take this punch list, then you turn around and you have this whole process of, okay, we have all these things we need to implement. What is our process for implementing new controls, new policies, new procedures? Now, those are going to go through change management. They're going to be defined. They're going to be communicated. They're going to be enforced. So, I mean, that's what all the gap analysis is all about. Okay. I think I have kind of beaten this topic to death on this. I didn't really mean to, but I really appreciate gap analysis. It's really important because you need to know how to get where you want to go. And sometimes the only way to determine that is to look at both sides. Where are you at now? Where do you want to go? And you have to evaluate that middle piece. Now, in some cases, let's say you do a gap analysis. You bring in an auditor or a third-party firm or something. They come in and they say, okay, this is how you get to where you need to go. That's not the only way. Just like mitigating controls. You don't always have to. Here's an argument that I got into, not an argument, a discussion a couple of days ago about Windows XP. Now, you talk to any IT person, they're going to say you should never have Windows XP on your environment. If you have it, you need to shut it down now. It's not getting updated. It's not getting patched. You should not have it. And I understand it, and I don't disagree with that sentiment, except for the fact that there are cases where you have to maintain a Windows XP box for a particular service. So what do? You put in mitigating controls. Let's say you take that machine off the network, you air gap it, you remove all your network devices off of it, so no Ethernet, no wireless, no nothing. You You put if you have to have it on the network, you put an extra firewall in place. You do all these different things to mitigate the control. Doing your gap analysis is very similar. You may not be able to get from where you are right now to where you want to go from A to B, as simply as, oh, deploy multi-factor. There may be a lot of reasons why you can't do that, or you can't do it in the basic sense. You have to do a little bit more complicated. So that's where your evaluation of you develop your project and your process plan for implementing these new controls, policies, and procedures. You work through the process of what do you need to do. Now, a good consultant, or a SME, or a CISO, and this is what our job is as CISOs, is we sit down and we do this stuff. We figure out what are these new processes and these new controls. What do you do to get from point A to point B in the most effective business manner as you can and still meet all the requirements that you have? Let's go back to the DDoS protections. Ultimately, you want to protect against a DDoS. That's what most people will tell you, but I'll tell you this. In a lot of cases, when we're talking about the business just needs to continue to function. The DDoS is a symptom of a larger problem. So while effectively I need to stop the DDoS, what I really need to be thinking about in the environment is how do I keep my business running regardless if I'm getting DDoSed or not. That's a slightly different way of thinking about it, and I think that a lot of cases that's where the CISO needs to come in and begin thinking about it. It's not about just defending against the DDoS. It's about making sure the business can run, or whatever the control is, or whatever we're discussing. So when you start thinking about it in that point of view, it's not always the simple answer of do this thing. Maybe you have to do 3 or 4 things to meet this requirement, to meet the compliance, to meet the regulation, to implement this control. So it can get really complicated really quick. But that's where I think our job as CISOs, we have to sit down and really think about this stuff, do this gap analysis, be comfortable doing the gap analysis. Now I'll tell you this, the only way to get comfortable is do it. Every single time you have a situation of you need to do something new, do a gap analysis. Do a formal gap analysis. That means have a process, have a document that you fill out, just like you would if you were doing it for a compliance or a new guideline, new requirement of law. You have a formal process. Okay, this is what we did. This is who was involved. Here is what we evaluated. This is where we need to go. Excuse me. This is what we need to do to meet those requirements. So do it on a small scale so that when you have to do it on a large scale, it's that much simpler. Okay, let me get back to the main screen here. That was gap analysis. I know we just kind of brushed the surface, and that was all I really wanted to do, is talk to you about the pieces you need to think about when you're doing a gap analysis, and why it's not a risk assessment, because those are different things. You can use a gap analysis in your risk assessment, and vice versa, but they are separate things. Now, gap analysis is not specifically a cybersecurity thing. It's used in every industry, every environment. Honestly, you use gap analysis all the time. When you're driving down the road, you're thinking about where you're at right now and where you need to go, and your gap analysis is how do you get there. That's a simplistic way of thinking about it, but we do this every day, and we just don't think about it in that manner. So I hope everyone was able to get something out of this. This is a good topic. This is something that people need to think about. This is something that people really need to evaluate. My recommendation is to do this, get help doing it, find someone who does this and work with them that learn this skill set. It doesn't take... Gap analysis can be very, very difficult because there's a lot of pieces you've got to think about. The process isn't that hard, but think about all the different pieces. That can be difficult. So getting some experience with that is critically important for the organization. So, all right. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this streamcast. I'm glad I'm back in it. I'm sorry I yawned so much. It's been a long couple of weeks. I can't even remember the last time I did. I think it's been 4 weeks, 5 weeks since I've been able to get this on. But I'm hoping that I'll be able to do it for the next few weeks since we've got holidays coming up. So hopefully I've got just a little bit more time that I'll be able to do this. I did get reached out to by a friend of mine who wants to come on to the Streamcast with me and talk about some more GLBA stuff and have this interaction between the two of us. I think people will really enjoy that. I think it'd be a lot of fun. So I'm going to set that up and get that ready to go. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. I hope you guys get some sleep. I hope you guys will be able to take this content and go into work tomorrow and think about doing gap analysis and what you're doing. Think about it in just your next projects, and it provides you a way to make things a little bit more efficient. Make sure you hit the targets you're trying to hit, and otherwise to protect your organization and protect the people in your organization. So have a great night. We'll see you next time.